What regard do we have for the most meaningful things done for our benefit? Seems to me those who gave us life or saved our lives should figure highly in our hearts. Being part of humanity, wouldn't we acknowledge and honor those who, for the greater good, fought, gave generously, or personally sacrificed for us all? What about those whose sacrifice for the greater good was unrecognized and through ignorance and bigotry sold as quite something else? What is our humanity in its best sense, and how is that quality measured and verified? How far would humanity have come without its most humane qualities being advanced and shared with all and honored by example and remembrance? If we live an examined, principled life, wouldn't we ask worthy questions as these, and in the face of them, make evaluations of ourselves from time to time? Do we want to be a person who adds to a better condition of humanity? And wouldn't we want to know if we participate, even unwittingly, in the cruel suffering of others by the content of our hearts and words, if not also by our deeds against them? I'm sure we hope people's behavior and the human condition are no worse than we thought. But sobering realizations might confront us as we take a closer look at profoundly important issues which we might assume were well addressed and settled, to yet again discover things are not as we first thought. I would not carelessly burden you with what we are about to cover, but it is important, because so many of you watching this may literally owe your life and limb to tough choices, heroic efforts, risky decisions, and sacrifices made for the health of humanity during a particular crisis many years before most of you were born. If we hold dear the quality of our humanity and are the people we believe we ought to be, shouldn't we feel compelled, at least sometimes, to take an unwavering look at tough humanitarian issues of great importance to see if we really understand them, especially if we make judgments of high consequence about other people based on that understanding? What then if we find there was quite enough reason to change the perspective upon which we used for that judgment? This is in part an oral history of my experience and perspective of the sometimes horrific, long and heartbreaking journey dealing with the AIDS epidemic in its early years. This is also a critical examination of the beliefs, assumptions, and judgments that much of the general public seems to have about people with HIV and how the epidemic began. The public's view is important and difficult to overstate because of the cascade of consequences that result from their perception. I am not a perfect messenger, but some things need to be said. This message is not perfectly composed. I might even be a little redundant. But the issues we will examine are worthy to be addressed and worthy of more questions with answers and realizations that I hope will inform and inspire our better natures to seek a more comprehensive picture of the truth. I have engaged questions and issues about the epidemic for decades. This is as painful for me as it is haunting. It's just hard to ignore that for such a long time, a cruel potential resides in the hearts of too many people who unwittingly base their opinion on a picture composed with parts missing as they consider the epidemic and pass some judgment on people with HIV, usually because of who they are and how they came to have it. But I think many of those people might not intentionally hold inhumane opinions about the epidemic, except to protect their hearts from feeling the personal pain of yet another awful human tragedy of tremendous proportion, but now with unexpected and haunting implication. When you know enough, it seems wrong to leave a harmful situation unchallenged, where the fearful, cruel, and violent side of human nature is enabled to persecute and convict the innocent, often in the name of righteousness. Especially bad when organized groups of people target a smaller group whom they had already long been trained to despise. It seems quite evident to me that there is important information missing from the public perception. And because of this absence in the public mind, I think it enables for too many an overly simplistic, irrational, and falsely moralistic view towards most of us burdened with HIV disease, You might imagine this can make for a rather bad situation for us as we try to keep what health we may have. Adding insult to injury, these unchecked effects of ignorance can multiply, having great effect on the judgment of the dominant cultural and historical perspective. Such exponential ignorance can add much to hostile, unqualified judgments being cast over most of us who have HIV or died of AIDS, and stain unjustly how we will be remembered. Based on valid reasoning and published evidence, I'm sure we deserve better than that. We shall take a look at the situation based on more of the relevant evidence than seems to have reached most people, because it suggests, to put it mildly, a more complex origin of HIV/AIDS than is generally believed. We will also examine a rather likely why this never-before epidemic came to be. Concerning the origin of AIDS, most people seem to rely on many untested assumptions, so a fresh perspective is needed, carrying as few assumptions as possible to realize the broader picture. Sacrifice is one issue that will be included. And as I ease you into that realization, I hope through learning more of the truth of what happened decades ago and its common sense implications, that it might encourage the better part of one's humanity, especially from those whose judgment relied on insufficient knowledge driving their opinion as they rushed to conclusions about people burdened with this new disease. Because some of us have surely suffered at the hands and hearts of those who believe they are just to accuse, punish, and make example of us publicly and privately. The origin of the epidemic seems to be a hotly debated issue among relevant professionals, some with strongly opposed positions. We will examine relevant and available evidence with citations and references of what I think is a fair representation of the situation by including some journal articles from those who study the issue as scientists, and at least one science writer, as well as others who report and critically examine other relevant situations, some with startling evidence. Some things I bring up and their common sense implications may shock or disturb some of you. That's not my intent. There may be those who would attack the messenger if they can't really attack the message. As you will see, these things I present are valid and they exist in the real world, whether or not I ever lived to tell you about them. In preparing this, I have tried to present publications in the context the author intended, and that the evidence that some presented could be self-evident as suggesting more than one implication, interpretation, or conclusion. If it's nighttime and you will soon go to sleep, I don't advise watching this now. Try earlier in the day. If you're not well, if you're depressed, don't watch this. Come back when you're better if it is still appropriate for you. This could be a rabbit hole from which you may not return as you were, as I have found. You may be happier not knowing. You'll probably sleep better. Before I get into the published evidence and arguments about the origins of AIDS, it would probably help to learn something about me through the actions I have taken to constructively deal with the epidemic. And in listening to my experience, I hope you might better perceive my humanity and motivation for speaking to you, along with the principles that I hope will become evident, so that people with hardened hearts might see this situation more as it really is, and be persuaded to do less harm to us, and perhaps even help. I think it's important to keep an open mind in the face of what we do not know and question often. I knew I had the virus before I started tending people with AIDS. Probably had it for years. The first person I tended was my partner. He had his own small, successful business and a house when I met him. He was very self-reliant, fun to be with, and passionate about life for as long as he was able. The last several months of his life, he needed more and more help. This began in late 1987. 18 hours a day for 5 months I tended him until he died. He had trouble seeing. The effects of the cancer blocked his vision. The cancer almost completely covered him. He really had more spots than a leopard, and some so large and grotesque they seemed to be eating him alive. In the end, it so disfigured him You could not recognize him except for his voice. I tell you these things as an example of sacrifice to keep in mind. I hope a more clear meaning of this will become apparent later on. After my partner's death, I took a course to become a certified home health aide. I began work right away. It seemed this completely new and bizarre pandemic was going to be profound in its effect on humanity, and surely the humanity that has touched me. It wasn't going away anytime soon. There would be great need for personal care of many people. The sick and dying was going up more quickly. I wanted to help us for as long as I could. I knew it would be tough emotionally, but you could see what it meant to the people who were helping. I realized also I was likely sacrificing what few years I had left of good health to better enjoy what remained of my life, to be instead in the trenches. Of course, I would likely see in some of my patients how I would die. I can't speak for everybody, but you always felt like you didn't have much time. 2 to 10 years, they were saying. So you probably had 6 by the time you found out. As much as you wanted to feel hope, it seemed more like denial. The evidence was brutal. I was an aide from 1988 through most of 1994. I attended my patients in their homes or at an AIDS hospice. When I began tending people with AIDS, I found there was need for a friendly face. I soon learned from patients that some home health aides preferred not to tend people with AIDS, perhaps even most. Some of that was probably just fear of this new disease. And there were some patients who told me how offensive it felt as they learned just how they were regarded by some home health aides, even by their doctor. It might even come from their own family. In a manner of speaking that is perhaps a little unfair, it was Bible country. Just for being gay, one never knew in the course of a normal day around town when or where you would hear a hostile comment or get a look that showed some people clearly despised you, or worse, outnumbered. Of course, it wasn't every day nor everybody, but common enough. Especially bad when you're in significant pain of one kind or another. As things were, you felt alone enough in a reliably hostile environment. And now this, AIDS and gay, it felt we were thought of as the same thing. Often after getting to know a new patient, I would later learn from their loved ones that the patient was quite different weeks or months before. That much of their mind and personality had gone or changed before I met them. It was sometimes a rather startling realization. Some were challenging to deal with or would become so as they slowly lost their minds, and so many did in those days. I will spare you other gut-wrenching scenes that I witnessed and attended. But morbidity aside, situations came along for some patients that loved ones never dreamed they'd have to face. Terrible situations forced horrific choices that had to be made and dealt with, and were a nightmare for all involved. I can't say any more than that. I did much of what my patients could not do for themselves, more as they got worse. In that situation, you become something more than an acquaintance or a worker. I bathed them. I clothed them, prepared meals, fed them if they were unable, read to some who lost their sight, shared conversation if they wanted company. Of course, virtually all did. Actually, for most, it was difficult not to become like friends. And as it happens, as they got worse, I could not help but hear them endure their condition to the end. There were some I held. For the most part, once I began with a patient, I tended them in regular shifts until they died. I began this work in Austin and stopped a couple of years after moving to San Francisco. I couldn't endure and suffer anymore. I wasn't feeling so great. Depression was getting worse. I was getting slower. I think I was progressing in the cognitive effects. I went on disability. I tended more than 70 people with AIDS. Add to that all the people I personally knew to die of it. I lost count after 125. It can be costly sometimes, looking back, to remember them. Very much like watching good people mowed down together, but in silence. That's how it is. The 1980s to the mid-90s, those were really bad years. Practically no hope if you were already going downhill. More and more guys I knew were dying or simply disappearing, never to be heard from again. Good guys, beautiful guys. So many who made the world a better place. In a manner of speaking, so many were better than I. They were more talented and accomplished. Many had such a gift with people. Some could bring out life and laughter that a house full of people could enjoy for hours. And they did not make a mistake nor a hurtful comment, even as they might make a little fun with you among your friends in a way that was, in truth, loving, not humiliating. They had so much talent and easy grace with people as they caused lively enjoyment among friends and acquaintances alike through the generosity of their humanity. Just talking, sharing fun stories, interesting stories, playing cards, what have you. Sort of a happy hour at their home. It was quite a regular event. One guy really had a talent for making people laugh, how he could keep the moment going. The neighborhood weekend social get-togethers would usually happen at his house. It was just before AIDS hit. They lit up a room when they entered. I was kind of quiet, a bit of a loner, but friendly. Depressed, I guess, but pleasant enough. I so admired how easily they could bring more life to the moment. There were more funerals to attend. It seemed like one every month or 6 weeks for years. It wears you down, makes you feel worse. But you go and you endure out of respect and more. And then one day you realize you have to stop going. And you felt bad about that too. I was so weary, but wasn't giving up yet. I continued as I was able, reading up on what was happening in AIDS research and treatments. I felt I could arm myself with something or some knowledge that could help me learn what of this terrible situation was really understood and build on that. Something that could help me hold on, because for years it really felt like I was holding on by my fingernails. For me, having HIV was a lot of stress with no end in sight. What hope I had seemed kind of hollow. Life seemed to have better meaning by living more in the moment. As bittersweet as that was, appreciating what life you had left. Thinking about the future or career desires seemed just another symptom of denial. In those days, I remember many times waking up from a pleasant dream as the person I used to be and feeling good, completely forgetting the epidemic. Then, instantly, I'm in shock as it dawns on me the nightmare of my real life. What was in store for me that day at work. For a time, I volunteered at an AIDS resource nonprofit helping to make available information to others like me who were trying to find some ways to hold on to some health. If nothing else, learn what was wrong with this immune dysfunction and possibly treat that. This was one of the reasons I moved to San Francisco, to brainstorm with others and discuss strategy and just learn more. Actively try to survive and help others find answers. Experimental drug trial access seemed more likely if I lived there. This was before the effective treatments started coming along about the mid-90s. But let's go back to about early 1989 when I lived in Austin, within a few months of my beginning to tend people with AIDS. I heard the first unsettling suggestion for how the epidemic might have started. The explanation seemed so bizarre and disturbing I was immediately skeptical and dismissive of it. But since day one I felt there was some odd circumstance about this new disease, so I listened. An author, speaking on a local cable program about his book concerning the origin of AIDS, talked about, among other things, testimony presented by a Defense Department spokesman to an Appropriations Committee in 1969. The description of the effect of the biological agent they were supposedly considering was a good short description of AIDS. I didn't believe it really. It startled me. But I must say it stuck with me. It took me a while to actually go and look for this supposed 1969 testimony in federal documents, but in 1993, with a little help at a library, I finally found it. Sure enough, it said exactly as the author claimed. Even the librarian that helped me seemed to take special notice as she read it too. My heart was about to jump out of my chest. I was to find out years later there could be a rather likely explanation for a Defense Department contemplating the feasibility of an AIDS-like bioweapon in the 1960s. No need to create one. I think it was simply to notice that the same kind of Asian monkeys used in laboratories to test the safety and efficacy of vaccines intended for humans, that these lab monkeys were dying with AIDS-like conditions in the 60s. If these test monkeys were showing disease like this, it would then seem to follow in rational thought to anyone at the time with the presence of mind or the professional responsibility to notice that the implications were unavoidable and perhaps ominous for public health. Something bad for humans might at least exist, or worse, might already be among some of us. This was about 10 years before AIDS was noticed in the U.S. We'll examine some Science Journal evidence and other things in a moment. I think it's appropriate to directly confront those who were hostile to us in the worst years of the epidemic, and likely still are. At a funeral, usually it was a priest or preacher believing he was righteous, making scathing example of the man who died of AIDS, right in front of friends and loved ones who gathered for him. These supposedly moral leaders said cruel, ugly things about the deceased before he was being lowered into his grave. I know, because I was present at several such offenses, and I've been told this was not an uncommon occurrence. Well, these predatory opportunities were not limited to funerals. From time to time you'd happen upon a religious radio or TV broadcast or local cable program where a moral leader would bring up AIDS and effectively indoctrinate their followers to believe the usual ugly, offensive, untrue stuff about us. This was no small thing. When those dehumanizing words reached the ears of some faithful, highly motivated people, I'm sure it had great effect, and they outnumbered us many times over. Already emotionally primed to fear and despise gay folks, it was easier to double down when AIDS came along, and these things can and do play out in public and in one's own family to devastating effect. To all those evangelists, priests, preachers, politicians, and at least one pope who generated judgment, blame, hostility, and tacit approval for violence against us, to their millions, I tell you, you harmed us. Besides harming us emotionally and our family ties, you sowed such potential in your followers that I'm sure it cost more than a few of us our lives. After all, wasn't that true for centuries? I was driving in rural Minnesota, a little southwest of Minneapolis, in the summer of 1986 or a year or two later. I had the AM radio on. I'm fairly sure I was listening to a local university station, and I heard a news report from it that some guy had apparently been lynched and he was HIV positive and gay, I guess. I really wasn't paying all that much attention to the report until the words hanged and HIV popped up and some mention of people being involved. I distinctly remember being shocked but still having to keep driving as I tried to listen for more. After all these years, I still have the recollection that the report was cut off in mid-sentence and went directly to the next story. I would be surprised if the lynching report went as long as 10 seconds. So there wasn't much to go on. I do remember trying to listen for a location where it happened or for that of the radio station, but what stuck in my mind was hearing a name, the name of a town, Shakopee or Chaska. I remember checking the map as I was driving. I was about 15 miles from the area. I have tried over the years to find out more, but with no success. But I feel certain I heard a report that a guy like me had been lynched, and it was very recent, seemingly nearby. One thing's for certain, it's the kind of thing you don't totally forget, even after 30 years. I still think about what happened to him. I want to know his name. How did he feel as he faced his death? What were his last moments like? I imagine he was surrounded by so much hate, judgment, and conviction overpowering him. Horror, hopelessness, aloneness, cruel agony, all at once. I hope it was quick. But these things. AIDS was kind of new then. I feel sure some hysterical, fear-driven people were freaking out to find something even worse than a leper in their midst. The kind of person they were trained to fear and despise, and worthy of execution. I imagine they likely invoked well-known, relevant Bible verses, helping them to feel it was their duty to kill him for the greater good. If they only knew what they had actually done, because there's quite enough evidence for the real possibility. The man they lynched was already a sacrifice for them. Acquiring the disease through a cascade of unintended consequences from accidental and deadly seeds of long ago heroic but necessary, risky medical contributions designed to eradicate disease for all. Yet he suffered cruel and horrific injustice enabled through fear, ignorance, bigotry, and other unfortunate human perspectives. I'm sure many people highly doubt that HIV could be a possible outcome of well-considered risks that were accepted for us all decades ago to end one or more diseases. Many people would not take that premise seriously, and thus the sacrifice, simply because of the decades-long impression they have from the sources they trust about how the epidemic began. They might dismiss the idea out of hand, even though they never critically examined what they only took on faith. And some people seem too emotionally invested in their preferred notion to challenge it. I invite all to keep listening, because there is evidence that should compel an impartial perspective to reconsider. Perhaps most people don't really care how the epidemic started. Probably they're more interested in how not to get it. Some seem content to believe vague stories based on a simplified sequence of events to explain the origin of AIDS, but examining reality requires more effort from us. And I think as you investigate further, it eventually becomes haunting. Stuff keeps turning up that suggests real possibilities, and the new implications touch practically everyone. I think such evidence and reasoning still stands well over the years in the face of critical examination. Yes, I think the man they lynched was, in a very real sense, a sacrifice, as would be practically anyone else, positive or negative, who would bear significant personal consequences of the epidemic. To those opponents who are in the mood to attack this premise, be sure to hold on to some discipline as you critically examine and reconcile your own conclusions in the face of evidence you probably never knew existed in science journals and other publications that we'll soon see. A blunt way to put it, what if AIDS is an accidental but lab origin disease? Would people learn new meaning from evidence they never before examined? Would hostile organizations see people with HIV in a favorable light before change? Would they adjust their perspective for the better as they realize there's more to the picture than they knew that still has clear bearing on the question of how and even why this new disease began? And for those of us who are HIV positive, wouldn't we examine such questions if we had the strength to face an avalanche of emotions from the new and multiple implications? Wouldn't we also do it out of self-respect and respect for those who suffered and lost everything? Who would, by cruel irony for their sacrifice, be buried with a lie and the blame? I think those are just some of the issues staring us in the face, if we care. Shall we begin down that rabbit hole? Let's look at what we think we know. And as we learn together, I think we'll find it wasn't a rabbit hole after all, at least in its scope. I think you'll find this opens to much more possibility than you first thought. Don't worry, we won't have to look at too much to find it's not a ludicrous idea. After many years searching for answers about AIDS and its origins, it's difficult not to conclude that the seemingly widely held opinion about how the epidemic started is based on an unnecessarily narrowed version of events, rather than a more comprehensive integration of additional valid evidence, situations, and critical analysis that still has clear bearing on the question of how this new disease might well have been born. It seems most people think the origin of AIDS has been virtually proven and became epidemic through blood contact from an infected chimpanzee into a cut hunter. And this non-AIDS causing ancestral virus somehow changed enough to become AIDS causing, with a series of transmissions to other people in their travels around Africa before it all went to other continents. But this explanation is just a guess. Scientists don't really know how this new disease was born, and only some of them say so directly. Certainly the word proof or proven in this regard does not show up. But with evidence and rational thought, some scientists published conclusions toward an answer, but not as a proof of origin. It seems to me to believe that the natural transfer or bushmeat hypothesis is the only valid premise for the emergence of AIDS requires one or more of the following. Faith in the integrity of certain professions we trust to always ethically inform us. Faith that they would be reasonably open and even-handed in reporting directly relevant situations concerning the origin of AIDS without fear of the consequences of revealing certain available, crucial, yet uncomfortable facts needed for a more complete understanding. Assumption. Often a reliance on multiple assumptions regarding the origin of AIDS, of which a layperson or even a scientist might be unaware. Bias. Simply an individual's mere preference of who or what to believe. And then there's denial, that there is sufficient evidence and valid reasoning to support at least one other way the epidemic could have started. Denial driven, I suppose, by the unsettling implications of a more comprehensive picture, composed of relevant and sturdy evidence from investigative reports that employ critical thinking, some of which are found in peer-reviewed science journals. I'm sure that it's daunting, even scary, when one realizes the possible consequences of reporting certain facts in this matter. But to report less than the whole truth, I think, enables an illusion in the public mind that the origin of AIDS has been fairly and ethically resolved with no reasonable disagreement contradictory evidence nor glaring omissions found, even among experts of relevant professions. And from the darker side of human nature, through ignorance of the whole truth, unfair and vindictive judgments can take hold against the infected, enabling a cruel narrative in hostile hearts, increasing the potential for mistreatment and violence against the innocent. I think if one takes a more incisive look at a range of valid arguments and their likelihoods, with the additional relevant evidence they bring, you might realize there's at least one other way this new virus could have been born, and you might well conclude, as I believe, it most likely happened accidentally because of a risky pursuit of perhaps more than one noble cause. Some scientists claim to refute a hotly debated contaminated polio vaccine hypothesis, but to simply refute does not mean to disprove. And I think certainly not disproven when you critically examine the details of this refutation and contrast that with the relevant details from the investigative journalist they seem to oppose. Regarding just one point, according to the journalist, the wide range from which hundreds of chimpanzees were captured, whose organs were harvested for medical purposes connected to at least by circumstance and testimony to suspect vaccine production and development in Africa some 60-odd years ago. Contrast and compare the refutation, which used much more recent sampling of SIVs from wild chimpanzees just in the vicinity of said lab some 50-odd years later. I don't think it's really a faithful sampling reflecting the original conditions, and perhaps it's not possible after several decades to reproduce the conditions and the wide range from which the chimps were gathered. At any rate, it's not the only time and place that chimpanzee tissue and changed viruses could have found their way into vaccine production intended for people. Regarding assumptions for the natural origin of AIDS, it's not as simple as finding a primate in the wild infected with an ancestral virus that just somehow changed in the mid-20th century to become the virus we know. The ancestral virus needed help to change, the kind of help it evidently didn't have for 50,000 years of humans interacting with non-human primates harboring those same ancient viruses. Some scientists point out that the virus needed help to change, help to become HIV, and they concluded it was through serial passage of the ancestral virus in human tissue, and thereby became so successfully adapted as to be AIDS-causing. They concluded it was most likely due to unsterile injection, needle, and syringe reuse. It seems relevant to point out that a rather innovative approach in the early polio vaccine days to keep out known pathogens from vaccine development and production employed what looks like serial passage, as was mentioned in the Science Journal articles from 1961 and 1962. If a soup of such possible consequences had unknown and undetected problematic biological contaminants, might they then quickly gain changes and adaptive success to human tissue by such passage techniques? Might something like that be how AIDS was born? I think if dirty needle reuse caused sufficient serial passage conditions for viral adaptation, there should have been a plethora of different HIVs, not just HIV-1 and HIV-2. Since there are over 20 different SIVs in Africa, it seems there should have been quite a few more than two. Ask yourself, were there vaccines made using tissues from primates now considered to be the source of ancestral HIV-1 and HIV-2? And why do simple questions like that not show up much in Science Journal articles, and seemingly never in news media? That's a major resource our political enemies use to base their opinions in their cultural war against us. Therefore, I think uncritical reporting in this issue is damaging and further enables cruelty. In those early years, if a retrovirus was detected as a contaminant in vaccine tissue culture, it may have been reasonably assumed to be of little consequence, since retroviruses were not known to cause serious disease several decades ago. There seems to have been a lot of contaminants in those early vaccines. So add to this picture multiple viral contaminants and their propagation in vaccine production, it seems quite reasonable that unknown and unintended changes might also become multiplied, perhaps exponentially. And because of those changes in conditions that don't occur in nature, the possibilities, I think, increase for giving rise to bugs that had important changes that one did not find in natural settings. Some scientists seem to assume that the disease of AIDS is a zoonosis, a disease humans catch directly from a non-human animal such as rabies. Still, other scientists point out that AIDS has not been proven to be a zoonosis. This seems important as it is directly relevant to rather basic questions about the origin of AIDS. To this day, there seems to be no proof nor evidence that someone contracted AIDS directly from a wild primate. Seems to me an important point to keep in mind. And then there's the issue of laboratory primates, after having been injected for years with various things, some of those things being viruses, probably some unwittingly changed, then to be released back into the wilds of Africa decades ago. It's a humane thing to do, to release an animal that has been caged and experimented on for years. But it seems to confound forever an unassailable conclusion in science journal articles based on assumed to be pristine sampling of naturally occurring viruses found in present-day wild primates. If laboratory primates and thus changed viruses within them were released into the wild decades before. A secure claim that there is in one area of Africa a natural origin of an AIDS-causing virus for chimpanzees seems confounded by the account of a primatologist who reports regarding the very same area the vaccination of wild chimpanzees with polio vaccine in the mid-1960s, and that is decades before AIDS was discovered in those primates. In the mid-20th century, and for the first time, primate organs were used to make vaccine tissue culture for human immunizations. Back then, controlling the contamination of tissue culture could be quite problematic, and reportedly continued to be so for at least a couple of more decades. It seems to me that the tissue culture is inextricably linked to AIDS, partly because of when, where, and in whom AIDS was first noticed. And because of its link to contamination, I think this disease may have at least one more significant element involved in the emergence of HIV-1 or the morbidity of AIDS than most people have considered thus far. Some of the scholarly criticism of vaccine contamination for the origin of AIDS seems to be more like excuses to reject rather than reasons to consider as probable or likely. For further information, I recommend the following: the paperback version of The River by Ed Hooper, an investigative report looking into the origins of AIDS and, among other things, the very experimental, even cavalier polio vaccine days of the mid-20th century. A ton of interesting things are in that book. There's a book by Michael Gold called A Conspiracy of Cells. Now, don't trip on the title. This book engages the significant contamination problems that plagued tissue culture decades ago. A well-known and notoriously problematic cell line is covered in that book and describes how relatively few scientists seemed aware of the problem and even fewer capable of controlling it. I recommend also the 90-minute documentary The Origins of AIDS by Peter Chappell and Catherine Pex. If you want to see and hear the very people involved in making and administering a particular polio vaccine in a relevant area of Africa, and so much more, I very much recommend you see that documentary. A Strange Case of Certainty, written by Robert Dildine in 2015, gives a detailed analysis of what seems to be biased treatment and unethical tactics employed by some scientists and publications to try to discredit the oral polio vaccine hypothesis proposed by science writer Ed Hooper in his book, The River. I found it quite readable and very enlightening, and I think you will too. Polio was a big public health concern in the mid-20th century. Some people took on the daunting task to rid humanity of that awful disease, and it had to be done on a massive scale through vaccination. But there wasn't a lot known about how to do it with much safety. So, in attempting that, unforeseen things may be in the mix, along with the consequences that would have been common sense. Those who stepped forward to the challenge knew it was risky. Something bad might happen. One vaccine maker commented about the risk, saying, in effect, "You pays your money and you takes your chances." But someone had to try because it seemed there was something of a panic in the mid-20th century about polio. Many people were being crippled or dying, mostly children, and the number of cases were rising more quickly. So I imagine there was a lot of pressure to do something about it, and soon. I sincerely have no intent to attack nor level blame at people connected to those early vaccines, as risky as they were. My intent here is simply to educate, with the hope that through learning more of the available valid evidence, situations, and arguments relevant to the uncomfortably real possibilities of how the epidemic may have started, that people might realize the significant experimental risks that were taken for the greater good in that heroic, laudable worldwide effort several decades ago to protect us all and future generations from that dread disease, polio. I also hope people realize that some of those creative, innovative, yet risky efforts toward that goal may well have accidentally spawned a new and quite deadly disease, and perhaps at two different times and places. I believe that's what happened. I know there is valid evidence and sound reasoning to support the idea. Let's ask a hypothetical question. If risky worldwide health campaign efforts conferred the intended health benefit to the vast majority of people, including you, what ethical, humane response should there be toward people who received horrific, unintended consequences born from one of those risky efforts for the same worldwide goal? Would it be appropriate to blame and make example of these unfortunate people for political purposes? Is it not confusion of an ill-informed, judgmental heart to place blame on people who would be, in effect, a sacrifice for you? If you are someone who judges people for acquiring HIV, is it ethical to not critically examine, even once, your own conclusions about the origins of AIDS? Especially since you could be benefiting from the fortunate side of risky decisions decided for us all long ago, while you pass judgment on people who eventually received the unintended consequences of those risks. Isn't that just one of the ethical dilemmas we're faced with if we claim some standard better than just our feelings and beliefs in the matter? Those of us still living with this disease, especially those who endured the really bad years, we're older now. Our sacrifices are more than a few. Some are significant and ongoing. We have lost so much, so many deeply wounded. We bear the scars on our hearts, our minds, our bodies, our faces. Are we getting the help we need? Is there a roof over our heads? Can we keep our homes? Are we being evicted through no fault of our own and basically nowhere to go? And as we get older, with fewer resources, are we going to be forced back into the kinds of communities that we escaped long ago for our health? Are we getting enough to eat? And would you eat it? Because of the pervasive ignorance of how this epidemic was likely born and the bigotry it enables, for far too long we have been left to twist in the wind for any politician, organized religion, or self-styled moralist who wants to take a stab at us in front of their constituents or the congregation and assassinate our character, even at our graves, for the heinous crime of simply being human, living our lives, and sometimes courageously embracing one another intimately, even in the face of hatred and the unknown and unseen dangers, as humanity has always done. For so many of us, in that constant setting of judgment, hatred that surely outnumbers us, it now seems that hostility is on the rise, and our health care is seemingly under new threat. My hope is the better part of humanity would address our needs and finally honor those of us who sacrifice so very much by taking another look and bring critical examination to bear in light of the whole truth of what happened decades ago, why it happened, and for whom.